The bitter Chicago air sliced through the crumbling alleyways, seeping into every crack and crevice of the forgotten corners of the city. Olivia Morgan, a 12-year-old girl who had long since stopped counting the days she had been alone, tugged her oversized hoodie tighter around her thin frame. The fabric, worn and threadbare, offered little protection against the unforgiving wind, but it was all she had. Her sneakers, soles patched with duct tape, crunched softly over the frozen debris scattered across the pavement. She walked with practiced steps, her sharp eyes scanning the ground, the alley walls, the overflowing dumpsters, always searching for something. Anything that could be useful. A discarded jacket, a half-eaten sandwich, a tattered blanket. Things other people threw away but could mean the difference between life and death for someone like her. The world outside was vast, cold, and indifferent, a reality Olivia had learned to accept. At first, the loneliness had been unbearable, an aching void in her chest that never seemed to go away. But with time, she learned to survive, to navigate the unspoken rules of the streets. Keep moving, don't make eye contact, trust no one. The camp wasn't far now. Beyond the graffiti-covered overpass, in a forgotten pocket of the city, she had built a fragile sense of home, a crude shelter made of cardboard walls and a stolen construction tarp. It wasn't much, but it was hers. As she walked, her stomach growled, the hollow ache gnawing at her insides. Food could wait. It always had to wait. Then, a sound. Olivia froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was faint, almost lost beneath the city's distant hum. A cry, high-pitched, weak, unmistakably human. She turned, her pulse quickening as her gaze swept the alley. The sound came again, softer this time, more fragile. Her eyes landed on a crooked dumpster, its lid partially ajar. For a long moment, she hesitated. People left all sorts of things in dumpsters. She had learned that lesson the hard way. Memories of bitter encounters, sharp rebukes, and the ever-present danger of trusting the wrong thing flashed in her mind. This wasn't her problem. It couldn't be. She barely had enough strength to take care of herself. But then, the cry came again, thin and desperate. Something inside her shifted. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid, and what she saw made her stomach lurch. A baby. Small, impossibly fragile, wrapped in a ragged piece of fabric that had done little to keep out the cold. The infant's face was pale, its tiny hands curled into weak fists. Frost clung to the edges of the cloth, and Olivia could see the faintest tremble in the baby's body. For a split second, panic gripped her. She had never held a baby before, never even been this close to one. Her first instinct was to back away, to run, to pretend she hadn't seen anything. But the baby let out another whimper, barely more than a whisper of sound, and something in Olivia broke. "Hey," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the wind. "It's okay. I think you're okay." She reached in with clumsy hands, lifting the baby from the dumpster. Its body was impossibly light, the damp fabric stiff with frost. Olivia cradled the infant against her chest, feeling its faint warmth against her skin. Her mind raced. What was she supposed to do? Where could she take it? She had no food, no proper blankets, no idea how to care for a baby. But as the child nestled against her, its tiny body pressing into her own, she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she couldn't leave it here. The wind howled through the alley, rattling the loose metal of a nearby fire escape. Olivia took a deep breath, her grip tightening around the infant. "We'll figure it out," she whispered. "We have to." Her feet moved before her mind caught up, carrying her back toward the only place she had, her makeshift shelter in the camp. As she walked, the enormity of what she had just done settled heavily on her chest. Back at the camp, Olivia knelt on the cold ground, laying the baby onto the foam pad she used as a mattress. She layered every scrap of fabric she had over its tiny frame, trying to trap as much warmth as possible. "You need a name," she murmured, watching as the baby's tiny fingers twitched in the cold. She thought for a moment, then said it aloud. "Ryan." The name felt right, grounding in a way she didn't understand. Ryan. She had never had anyone before. No one to look after. No one to fight for. But now, staring at the fragile child bundled in scraps, she felt something foreign rise in her chest. A purpose. The hours passed in a blur of makeshift caretaking. Olivia scavenged water from a nearby fountain, warming it as best she could over a fire. She tore strips of fabric to make a crude diaper. Her hands moved with a determination she hadn't felt in years. As night fell, she sat beside Ryan, watching his shallow breaths. The fear clawed at her. How could she protect him? How could she provide for him when she could barely keep herself alive? Ryan stirred, his tiny hand reaching out from the blanket. Without thinking, Olivia placed her finger in his grasp. His fingers curled around hers. Weak but determined. A flicker of something ignited in her chest, determination. Fear, something deeper than both. "We'll figure it out," she whispered again, more to herself than to him. "We have to." Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault. But inside her makeshift shelter, Olivia held on to the fragile warmth of a new beginning. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she wasn't alone. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The real fight had just begun. The wind howled through the alleyways like a living thing, biting through Olivia's threadbare hoodie as she clutched the fragile bundle against her chest. The baby, Ryan, was far too quiet. His tiny body, wrapped in scraps of fabric, barely moved except for the faint rise and fall of his shallow breaths. Olivia knew enough to recognize the warning signs. The cold was draining him, swallowing what little life he had left. Fear curled deep in her stomach, twisting her insides. She had done everything she could, used every scrap of cloth, held him close, even warmed water over the weak fire she kept hidden behind a collapsed brick wall in the camp. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. She had always known hunger, always fought against the cold, always battled exhaustion. But Ryan had no fight left in him. And that realization gripped her with a terror she had never known before. Her mind raced, searching for a solution, but the truth loomed before her like a wall she couldn't climb. She was 12 years old, homeless, and alone. What did she know about keeping a baby alive? A sharp gust of wind rattled the flimsy tarp above her shelter, and Ryan whimpered softly in her arms. That tiny sound, so fragile, so helpless, sent a jolt of determination through her. She had to do something. And then she remembered the conversation from earlier, the murmured voices of the older men in the camp. The name that had stuck with her despite everything. Benjamin Reed. She didn't know much about him. Only that he was rich, the kind of rich that existed in a different world. The kind that lived behind iron gates and marble walls, untouched by the hunger and cold that defined her life. But the men had said something else too. That he was giving away food, medicine, that he had lost a son once. A man like that, Olivia thought, might just listen. Or maybe he wouldn't. Maybe they'd throw her out before she even got a word in. Maybe they'd call the cops. Maybe. Ryan whimpered again, his body too weak to cry properly. No more maybes. She had to try, pulling Ryan tighter against her chest. Olivia forced herself to her feet. Her legs were stiff from the cold, her fingers numb, but she ignored it. She had to. She wouldn't watch him die. She wouldn't let that happen. With each step away from the camp, the wind seemed to whisper warnings. This was a mistake. This was dangerous. The city wasn't kind to kids like her. But Olivia ignored the voices of doubt. She walked, past the alleyways that had become her home, past the darkened storefronts, past the places where the streetlights flickered weakly, as if even they were losing the will to fight against the night. The city transformed as she crossed into unfamiliar streets. The buildings grew taller, the sidewalks cleaner, the world quieter. This was where the rich lived. This was where he lived. By the time she reached the gated entrance of Benjamin Reed's mansion, her legs felt like lead. The estate loomed before her. Huge, imposing, untouchable. The iron gates stretched high, designed to keep people like her out. She hesitated. What was she even thinking? This was stupid. He wouldn't help her. But then Ryan shifted in her arms, letting out a tiny, broken sound, so weak it made her chest ache. It didn't matter if this was stupid. It didn't matter if they turned her away. She had no other choice. Gathering every ounce of courage she had left, Olivia reached for the intercom and pressed the button. The response was immediate. A voice, cold, clipped, indifferent, crackled through the speaker. "State your business." Olivia swallowed hard, her pulse hammering. Please," she stammered, pressing herself closer to the intercom as if that would somehow help them hear the desperation in her voice. I need to see Mr. Reed. A long pause. Then, Mr. Reed doesn't take visitors. She clenched her teeth, fighting the rising panic. He needs to, she said, louder this time. It's about my baby. He's sick. Please, I don't have anywhere else to go. Another pause. Then, leave the premises immediately. The intercom clicked off. No, 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 no. She slammed her fist against the gate, hot tears burning behind her eyes. Please, she shouted. He's going to die. I just need help. Silence. The house, with all its warmth and light, remained distant, unreachable. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She felt Ryan shift slightly against her chest. And for one horrifying second, she thought, no, he was still breathing, barely. A sob choked her, but she swallowed it down. What now? She could leave, go back to the camp, curl up in the freezing dark, and hope Ryan survived the night. Or, she turned and sank down by the gate, curling herself around Ryan, shielding him from the wind as best she could. She would wait. If no one came, if no one listened, then at least she would know she had done everything she could. The hours stretched on, the cold pressed deeper into her bones, stealing what little warmth she had left. She thought about running, she thought about giving up, but every time the thought crept in, she felt Ryan's tiny, fragile breaths against her chest. And so she stayed. And finally, the sound of tires crunching on the driveway. Her head jerked up. A sleek black car rolled to a stop just inside the gates. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in an expensive coat. His hair was dark, his features sharp, but it was his eyes that struck Olivia first, tired eyes. Haunted in a way she couldn't quite place. His gaze landed on her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, what the hell is this? His voice wasn't cruel, but it wasn't warm either. He was annoyed, suspicious. Olivia's throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak. Are you Benjamin Reed? His expression darkened. Who are you? She pushed herself up, legs shaky, and adjusted Ryan in her arms. My name is Olivia, she said, her voice small but steady. And this is Ryan. She hesitated, then added, the truth. I found him in a dumpster. Benjamin's expression changed. The irritation faded, replaced by something unreadable. Olivia took a deep breath. Please, she whispered. He's sick. I don't know what to do. I thought you could help. A long silence. Then, he exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. Jesus Christ, he muttered. He looked at the gate, at the girl standing in front of it, thin and shivering, cradling a baby that wasn't hers but might as well have been. He hesitated, then, finally, opened the gate. The iron doors creaked as they unlocked, and Olivia took a shaky step forward. As she crossed the threshold, the first sliver of warmth in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe. Maybe, just maybe, this was the moment everything changed. Maybe, for the first time in her life, she wasn't alone. The warmth of the mansion felt foreign against Olivia's frozen skin. As she stepped past the threshold, she hesitated, her fingers tightening around the bundle in her arms. Ryan had stopped whimpering, but his body was still too cold, too still. She should have felt relief. She had made it. She had gotten through the gate. But as she looked around the vast, gleaming interior of Benjamin Reed's estate, she only felt small. The foyer stretched out before her. Too big, too bright, too perfect. A grand staircase curved upward, disappearing into the shadows above. Everything smelled clean, polished wood, fresh linen, something floral and expensive. This was a place where people like her didn't belong. Here, a voice said sharply. Olivia turned. Benjamin Reed stood just inside the door, peeling off his leather gloves. His eyes, dark and unreadable, flickered over her hunched figure before settling on Ryan. Give him to me, he said. Olivia's arms instinctively tightened around the baby. She had carried him through the cold, fought for him, held him closer than she had ever held anyone in her life. And now, just like that, this stranger wanted to take him? She shook her head, stepping back. He's mine. Benjamin's expression hardened. You just said you found him in a dumpster. He's not yours. The words stung, but Olivia refused to look away. I'm all he has. A muscle in Benjamin's jaw twitched. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the millionaire in his spotless mansion, the homeless girl in her torn hoodie, the baby between them. Then, without a word, Benjamin turned and called out, "Annie." Footsteps echoed down the hallway, and a woman appeared, middle-aged, dressed in medical scrubs, her graying hair pulled into a neat bun. Her eyes widened when she saw Olivia, but she recovered quickly, her gaze shifting to Ryan. "Sir?" she asked. Benjamin gestured toward the baby. "Take him to the infirmary. Make sure he's—" His voice trailed off. "Make sure he's okay." Annie nodded and reached out her hands. "Come on, sweetheart." Olivia hesitated again. She didn't know this woman. She didn't trust these people. But Ryan needed help. More than she could give him. With shaking hands, she loosened her grip and placed Ryan in Annie's arms. As soon as the weight left her chest, she felt empty. "I need to stay with him," Olivia blurted. Annie's expression softened. "I promise. I'll take care of him." "But Benjamin's voice cut through her panic. "You'll stay here." Olivia turned, startled. He was watching her closely, his posture tense. "I'll have someone bring you food," he continued, "and a place to sleep." Her stomach twisted. Food, a bed. It sounded like a dream. But dreams didn't come true for girls like her. She lifted her chin, forcing herself to look strong. "I don't need your charity." Benjamin exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Jesus, it's not charity. Then what is it?" His expression flickered with something she couldn't read. Frustration? Guilt? Regret? "I don't know yet," he admitted. Then he turned and walked away. The staff treated her like a ghost. They didn't speak to her unless absolutely necessary. No one made eye contact. And whenever she passed by, they moved as if they were waiting for her to leave. She didn't blame them. She was waiting, too. But Ryan was still sick. So she stayed. They gave her a real bed in a small guest room. But she didn't sleep in it. She couldn't. Instead, she curled up on the floor by the door, the way she always had, ready to run if she needed to. Annie let her visit Ryan, but only for a few minutes at a time. He was weak, too weak, but at least he was warm now. Wrapped in soft blankets that Olivia never could have found in the streets. Still, the waiting felt like torture. And then, on the third night, she made a decision. The kitchen was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. Olivia stood in the doorway, hands clenched into fists. Benjamin was sitting at the counter, a glass of something dark in his hand. He didn't look up when she entered. "If you're looking for food," he muttered, "the staff knows to feed you." "I don't want food." Now he looked at her. His eyes were sharp, tired, curious. "What do you want, then?" Olivia took a deep breath. "I want to work." Benjamin blinked. "Excuse me?" She stepped forward. "You gave me a place to stay. You saved Ryan. I don't expect that for free. I can clean. I can cook." His lips curled slightly. "You're 12. I've been taking care of myself for years." She shot back. "I know how to survive." A long silence stretched between them. Then Benjamin sighed and set his glass down. "You're not scrubbing floors," he said. Her stomach twisted. Then, "I'll find something else," he interrupted. "Something better." Olivia frowned. "Like what?" Benjamin exhaled and stood up. His height was intimidating, his presence heavy. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I'll figure it out." And for the first time, Olivia saw something in his expression she hadn't seen before. A promise. Benjamin barely spoke to her after that. But he watched. He watched the way she sat beside Ryan's crib, fingers curled into the blankets as if she was afraid he would disappear. He watched the way she flinched when people spoke too loud, the way she held herself like she was ready to run. He watched the way she never ate in front of anyone, how she tucked extra food into her pockets when she thought no one was looking. And slowly, something in him shifted. One morning, he entered the kitchen to find her struggling to mix formula. "Not like that," he said. She jumped, nearly spilling the bottle. Benjamin sighed and stepped forward. "You're making it clump." He took the bottle, measured the powder, and mixed it with practiced hands. "Now it won't clog the nipple," he said, handing it back. Olivia stared at him. For the first time, she saw something beneath his cold, unreadable exterior. A father. Or at least, a man who used to be one. And suddenly, she realized why he was helping them at all. She had heard the rumors in the camp. Benjamin Reed had lost a son. And now, here she was, with a baby that wasn't hers, but might as well have been. Was that why he had let her in? Because he thought saving them might save him, too? Olivia didn't know. But for the first time, she wasn't sure she cared. Because Ryan was getting better. She wasn't cold or starving or alone. And for now, that was enough. But she knew it wouldn't last. Nothing ever did. The days passed in a strange, quiet rhythm. Olivia adjusted, slowly, awkwardly, but always with the sinking feeling that this wasn't real. Because one day, he would send her away. People like her didn't belong in places like this. And Benjamin Reed? He wasn't her father. He never would be. Or at least, that's what she told herself. Until the day Kimberly Reed walked through the door. And suddenly, Olivia realized, she wasn't fighting to survive anymore. She was fighting to stay. The mansion was warm, but Olivia still felt cold. It had been days since she arrived. But she still couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. The walls were too pristine. The floors too polished. The ceilings too high. Everything about this place screamed wealth, comfort, safety. Everything she had never had. She should have been grateful. She should have been relieved. But all she could feel was fear. Fear that this was temporary. Fear that Benjamin would wake up one morning, realize she was nothing but a street rat, and throw her back into the cold. Fear that she would have to say goodbye to Ryan before she ever got the chance to be his family. And so, every night, she lay awake on the cot in the small guest room they had given her, her body tense. Her ears straining for any sound that might mean it was over. Every morning, she woke up expecting it to be the last time she opened her eyes beneath a real roof. She was waiting for the moment she would lose everything again. Because in Olivia's world, nothing good ever lasted. Ryan was getting stronger. Olivia could see it in the color returning to his tiny face. In the way his fingers curled around her hand when she sat beside him. Annie, the woman who worked in the mansion's infirmary, checked on him constantly, adjusting his blankets, monitoring his breathing. She always reassured Olivia, saying, "He's going to be okay, sweetheart." But Olivia wasn't used to promises. And she wasn't sure she could trust them. Still, every time Ryan's tiny fingers wrapped around hers, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a flicker of hope. And hope was dangerous. Hope made you believe in things that weren't real. Hope made you think you were safe when you weren't. Hope made you weak. But when Ryan opened his eyes and looked at her, really looked at her, Olivia felt herself breaking apart. Because he needed her. And for the first time in her life, someone needed her to stay. Benjamin Reed wasn't unkind, but he wasn't warm either. Since the night he had let her in, he had barely spoken to her. He gave orders, short and direct, his eyes never lingering too long on her face. It was as if he was keeping his distance on purpose. And Olivia understood. She was a problem he had temporarily decided to fix. Nothing more. Which was why, when she stood in the kitchen one morning, trying to figure out how to mix formula for Ryan, she nearly jumped out of her skin when Benjamin's voice cut through the silence. "You're doing it wrong." She spun around, clutching the bottle as if she had been caught stealing. He stepped closer, sighing as he took the bottle from her hands. "You're putting too much powder in. It clumps." Olivia just stared as he poured the mixture down the sink, refilling the bottle with fresh water, measuring the formula with steady, practiced hands. "Now it won't clog the nipple," he muttered, handing it back. She hesitated before taking it. "How do you know how to do that?" she asked quietly. Benjamin's fingers curled into his palm. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I used to have a son." The words hit Olivia like a punch to the stomach. Because she had heard the rumors. Everyone in the camp knew about Benjamin Reed's dead son, Lucas. She had never said his name out loud. And now, as Benjamin turned away from her, his jaw clenched. She knew she wouldn't say it now. But suddenly, it made sense. Why he had let her in. Why he had let Ryan stay. Why he barely looked at her. She was a ghost of something he had lost. And that scared her more than anything. Because ghosts were meant to be let go of. Olivia tried to stay out of Benjamin's way. She spent her days in the infirmary, sitting beside Ryan, feeding him, watching as his tiny hands gripped her fingers like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. She wanted to believe this could last. But her past wouldn't let her. She knew people. She knew what happened next. Benjamin Reed had given her a roof, food, warmth. But at some point, he was going to change his mind. And when that happened, she needed to be ready. She needed to be able to survive the way she always had. Alone. But as much as she tried to prepare herself, she wasn't ready for what happened next. She wasn't ready for her past to come crashing into her future. It happened on a Sunday. She was sitting in the sunroom, feeding Ryan, when the front doors slammed open. The sound made her blood run cold. And then, a voice. Sharp, cold, unforgiving. "Benjamin, what the hell is this?" Olivia turned just in time to see her. A woman stood in the foyer, wrapped in an expensive coat, her heels clicking against the marble as she marched forward with dangerous purpose. Her blonde hair was styled to perfection, her lips painted in a color too rich for someone like Olivia to name. She was beautiful, she was powerful, and she was furious. Benjamin appeared at the top of the stairs, his expression unreadable. "Kimberly," he said flatly. His ex-wife. Olivia's stomach twisted into a knot. "What is this?" Kimberly snapped, her eyes flicking to Olivia, then to the baby in her arms. "Who is she? And why the hell is there a child in your house?" Olivia gripped Ryan tighter. She could feel it, the shift in the air, the danger. Kimberly turned back to Benjamin, her voice dripping with disgust. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You think this will fix things, don't you?" Benjamin's jaw tensed. "You think taking in some homeless girl and a baby is going to bring Lucas back?" The words were like a knife in the air. Olivia couldn't breathe. She knew, she had always known, that she didn't belong here. But hearing it out loud felt like someone had reached inside her chest and crushed her heart in their fist. Kimberly turned on Olivia, her icy gaze burning into her skin. "I don't know what kind of scam you're running," she hissed, "but trust me, you don't belong here." Ryan whimpered. Olivia's hands shook. Benjamin stepped forward. "Enough," he said, his voice like steel. Kimberly turned on him, rage flashing in her eyes. "You're a fool, Benjamin. You think these two are your second chance? They're nothing. They're no one." Benjamin's next words shook the walls of the mansion. "Their family." The silence that followed was deafening. Olivia stared at him, her heart pounding. Family. He had called them family. Could it be true? Could she finally have a place where she belonged? Could she finally have a home? Let us know in the comments. Should Olivia stay and fight for her place? If you believe she deserves love, warmth, and a family, hit the like button to show your support. Because for the first time in her life, Olivia dared to hope. And hope changes everything. For the first time in as long as Olivia could remember, she had begun to hope. She didn't say it out loud, that would make it real. And real things had a way of being taken away, but deep in her heart, something fragile had started to grow. Ryan was getting stronger. He had started reaching for her when she entered the room, his tiny fingers curling around hers like she was his whole world. And Benjamin, he wasn't warm, not exactly, but he was there. He didn't send her away. He made sure she ate. That Ryan had everything he needed. That she had clothes that actually fit instead of scraps picked from dumpsters. He called them family. She told herself not to believe it. She told herself that at any moment, the rug would be pulled out from under her. That this was too good to be true. But she wanted to believe. She wanted to believe so badly. Until the knock at the door shattered everything. It happened in the evening, just as the sky outside turned from pale blue to deep purple. Olivia had been sitting on the floor of the nursery, watching Ryan sleep, when the sound echoed through the grand hallways. 3 sharp knocks. Then voices. Low, urgent. Her stomach twisted. She crept toward the top of the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest, and peered down into the dimly lit foyer. Benjamin stood at the door, his posture rigid, and in front of him, a woman. Not Kimberly. Someone worse. A tall woman in a navy suit stood with her arms crossed, holding a clipboard against her chest. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, flicked from Benjamin to the house behind him with practiced indifference. A social worker. Olivia's stomach dropped. No, 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 no. She gripped the railing, straining to hear. Received reports of 2 minors living under unsuitable conditions. The woman was saying, her tone clipped and professional. "Mr. Reed, we're here to investigate." Investigate. The word sent ice through Olivia's veins. Ryan. They were here for Ryan. For her. She knew this would happen. She knew it was only a matter of time. Benjamin's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "Who filed the report?" "I'm afraid I can't disclose that." The woman replied smoothly. "We need to ensure the safety of the children." Olivia didn't have to hear the rest to know who was behind this. Kimberly. Her words from the other day still echoed in Olivia's mind. They're nothing. They're no one. She must have called the authorities. Told them Benjamin was unfit. That Olivia and Ryan didn't belong here. And now, everything was falling apart. Again. Where are they? The social worker asked. Benjamin hesitated. Barely. Then he stepped aside. Upstairs. Olivia's pulse roared in her ears. She should run. She should grab Ryan and disappear into the night before they could stop her. She knew what happened when people like this got involved. She had heard the stories, kids ripped away from their only family. Thrown into homes where no one really wanted them. Where they were just another name on a list. Another case number in a system too broken to care. She had spent years avoiding people like this. And now, she was trapped. Her legs refused to move as footsteps echoed up the stairs. Then, Benjamin's voice. Low, steady. I need to talk to her first. There was a long pause. Then the woman sighed. Fine, but we'll need to see the baby. Benjamin didn't reply. Instead, he turned and looked up at Olivia. Their eyes met. And in that moment, she knew. He wasn't going to let them take Ryan. He wasn't going to let them take her. She swallowed hard, then forced herself to move. One step, then another. By the time she reached the bottom of the stairs, her hands were shaking. Benjamin turned to her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. I won't let them separate you. Olivia's throat tightened. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him. But no one had ever fought for her before. No one had ever chosen her. And she was terrified that he wouldn't be the first. The next hour was a blur. The social worker asked questions, too many questions, while Benjamin's lawyer, who had arrived halfway through the interrogation, spoke in short, clipped responses, refusing to let her pry too deep. Ryan, oblivious to the storm raging around him, slept soundly in the nursery. When the woman finally closed her clipboard, her expression was unreadable. She turned to Olivia and asked the question Olivia had been dreading since the moment she walked through the door. Do you feel safe here? The words felt like a blade to the chest. Because this was a trap. If she said yes, it might not be enough. If she said no, they would take her away. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to meet the woman's gaze. Yes. The social worker's lips pressed into a thin line. Then, and what about the baby? Do you believe he belongs here? Olivia's stomach twisted. She knew what they were asking. They wanted to know if she believed Benjamin was fit to care for Ryan. They wanted to know if he was fit to care for her. She should say no. She should tell them the truth, that this was the best home Ryan would ever have. That Benjamin had given them more in a week than she had ever had in her entire life. But would it be enough? Would they believe her? Would they leave them alone? She forced herself to take a breath. Then she looked at Benjamin. At the man who had let her in when he didn't have to. At the man who had fought for them. Who had promised she wasn't a burden. Who had stood between her and Kimberly without hesitation. At the man who, whether he realized it or not, had started to become a father. She turned back to the social worker. And with every ounce of strength she had left, she whispered, yes. The social worker didn't say anything for a long time. Then she nodded. For now, she said, we'll leave things as they are. But we'll be back. Her gaze flicked to Benjamin. And I hope, for their sake, you're ready. Then she turned and walked out the door. The silence that followed was deafening. Olivia could feel her heart slamming against her ribs as she turned to Benjamin, waiting for him to say something, to tell her what came next. But all he did was exhale, running a hand down his face. Then, in a voice so soft she almost didn't hear it, he said, I'm never letting them take you. Her breath hitched, and in that moment, she knew, this wasn't over. Kimberly wasn't done. The system wasn't done. But neither was Benjamin. And for the first time in her life, she had someone willing to fight for her. Do you think Olivia and Ryan should stay with Benjamin? Let us know in the comments. Show your support by liking this post if you believe they deserve to stay together. Heart. Because this fight is just beginning. And Olivia is going to need all the support she can get. The cold hadn't left Olivia's bones. Even inside the mansion, she should have felt safe now. She should have felt warm. But ever since the social worker left, her body had been locked in that same fight or flight mode. Her muscles tight, her stomach in knots, her breath constantly catching in her throat. Benjamin had told her he wouldn't let them take her. But could she really believe him? Nobody had ever fought for her before. Nobody had ever stayed. And she was terrified that he would change his mind. She was terrified that this home, this warmth, this fragile thing she had started to hope for, would disappear just like everything else had. She had been stupid to believe otherwise. Because later that night, when she overheard Benjamin on the phone, her worst fears came true. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop. She had been passing the study. On her way back from checking on Ryan, when she heard her name, she should have walked away. But something in Benjamin's voice, low, heavy, full of something she didn't understand, rooted her to the spot. "This is getting out of control. Kimberly," he said, his voice sharp, tired, angry. "Kimberly." Olivia's blood turned to ice. "You think I don't know that?" came Kimberly's voice. Cold and clipped, like always. "You brought this on yourself. Benjamin, you let them in, and now, it's a problem." "A problem?" Olivia's stomach twisted. "I'm dealing with it," Benjamin said, "but if you keep pushing, I swear to God." Kimberly laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "You're in over your head. Ben, you think playing hero is going to make up for what happened to Lucas?" A heavy silence followed. Then, Benjamin's voice, quiet, pained. "This has nothing to do with Lucas." "Oh, it has everything to do with him." Kimberly spat. "And you know it." Olivia's breath hitched. "Lucas, Benjamin's son, the child he had lost." She knew, deep down, that Kimberly was saying what Benjamin wouldn't. That she and Ryan weren't here because they mattered. They were here because of Lucas. They were here because Benjamin was trying to fix something broken inside himself. And the moment he realized they couldn't, he would send them away. Just like everyone else had. The air in the hallway felt tight, suffocating. She had to get out. She had to. But as she turned, as she tried to disappear before she heard anything else, the floor creaked beneath her foot. The voices stopped. Her breath caught. And then, "Olivia?" Benjamin's voice. She felt it before she saw it, the shift in the air. The moment he realized she had been listening. Slowly, so painfully slowly, she turned toward the door. And there he was, standing in the doorway, looking at her like he knew. Like he knew what she had heard. Like he knew what she was thinking. "Olivia," he said again, softer this time, almost gentle. And that's what broke her. Because she couldn't do this. She couldn't do this again. She couldn't let herself believe she had a home, a family, only to have it ripped away from her. She couldn't survive that. And so, she ran. The cold hit her like a slap as she burst through the front door. She had no shoes, no coat, nothing but the thin hoodie on her back. But she didn't care. She just ran. Her lungs burned, her feet ached, but she didn't stop. Because she knew how this story ended. She had lived it before. Hope wasn't meant for people like her. She had let herself believe she belonged here. She had let herself believe Benjamin cared. But she wasn't Lucas. She never would be. She was a street kid with nothing and no one. And she had been stupid to forget that. She didn't know how long she ran before she collapsed in the alleyway. Her breath came in sharp, painful gasps. Her body shook violently. The pavement beneath her was ice cold. But she couldn't bring herself to move. She felt like she was disappearing. Like she was fading into the cold. And for a second, she almost let it happen. For a second, she thought, maybe this is how it ends. Maybe this is how it was always supposed to end. But then, a car, tires screeching, a door slamming, footsteps. "Olivia." The voice was desperate, raw. She knew that voice. "Benjamin." She tried to disappear into the alleyway. Tried to push herself deeper into the shadows. But she was too weak, too tired. And suddenly, he was there, kneeling in front of her, breathing hard, his coat undone like he had left in a hurry. For a moment, he just looked at her. And then, "What the hell were you thinking?" His voice was sharp, but there was something else underneath it. Something that sounded like fear. She turned her face away. "Go home." "No," he snapped, "not without you." She let out a bitter laugh. "Why? I'm not your problem, remember?" Benjamin went still. Then, to her absolute horror, he knelt down and cupped her face in his hands. His palms were warm, strong. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low, urgent. "You are not a problem. You are not a mistake. And I am not letting you go." She squeezed her eyes shut. She couldn't believe him. She couldn't. Because if she did, if she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she was worth something, and then he left, it would break her. So she shoved him away. "Stop lying," she yelled. Her voice cracked, raw, desperate. "You don't want me here. I'm not. She choked. I'm not Lucas. Benjamin flinched. For a second, she thought she had done it, she had pushed him away for good. But then he reached for her again. This time, he didn't let her push him away. No, he said quietly. You're not. Her chest ached. She was bracing for the words that would come next. She was bracing for rejection. But then Benjamin swallowed hard and said, and that's why I need you to stay. She froze. His voice broke. I lost my son, Olivia. His hands trembled against her cheeks. And if I lose you too, I don't think I'll survive it. She couldn't breathe. He meant it. He meant it. For the first time in her life, someone wasn't just asking her to stay. Someone was begging her to. And she didn't know how to handle that. So she did the only thing she could. She let herself fall against him. And he caught her, just like he always had. Just like he always would. He carried her back to the mansion. She didn't fight him, because for the first time, she wasn't afraid of staying. For the first time, she wasn't afraid to belong. Do you think Olivia should trust Benjamin? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe that family isn't about blood, but about who stays, hit the like button. Because maybe, just maybe, this isn't the end of Olivia's story. Maybe this is just the beginning. The mansion was quiet, but inside Olivia's mind, a storm raged on. She sat at the edge of the bed, knees pulled to her chest, staring at the thick blanket draped over her legs. It was soft, warm, so different from the scraps of fabric she used to layer together in the streets. She should have felt safe. She should have felt like she belonged. But after what had happened, after she had run, after Benjamin had found her, after he had held onto her and begged her to stay, something inside her was breaking. And now, there was Karen Wood, Ryan's grandmother, the woman who had been searching for him all along, the woman who could give him a life Olivia never could. And Olivia was about to lose the only person in the world she had left. She curled her arms around herself, biting her lip hard enough to draw blood. She had known this would happen. She had known. Nothing good ever lasted. Karen had arrived that morning. A driver had pulled up to the front gates in a sleek black car. And when the butler had opened the door, Olivia had known, before the woman even spoke, that she was there for Ryan. Her face was lined with grief but composed. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back. Her tailored coat pristine despite the harsh Chicago wind. She looked like she belonged in this world. Unlike Olivia, when she had stepped inside, she had barely even looked at Olivia at first. Her eyes had gone straight to the baby in the crib. She had covered her mouth with a trembling hand. And when she finally spoke, her voice had cracked. Peter. Not Ryan. Peter. The name hit Olivia like a knife to the chest. Because that was it, wasn't it? Ryan had never really been hers. She had given him a name, a home, a family in the only way she knew how. She had saved him, but he wasn't hers to keep. She should have known. Karen had turned to Benjamin, her voice shaking with emotion. I have been searching for him for months. She had said, his mother, my daughter, she didn't tell us until it was too late. She was struggling with postpartum depression, and in a moment of despair, she left him somewhere she thought he would be found. Karen had turned to Olivia then. Her eyes, so full of gratitude and grief, landed on the girl who had carried Ryan out of that dumpster. Who had fought for him. And she had whispered, you saved my grandson. Olivia had wanted to run. Because she wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready to say goodbye. But the worst part? She knew Karen was right. Ryan wasn't hers. And now, she had to let him go. Olivia hadn't spoken a word since Karen arrived. She had spent the day pacing the nursery, watching Ryan sleep, listening to the murmured voices downstairs as Benjamin and Karen decided his future. It wasn't fair. She had done everything right. She had kept him alive. She had loved him. But love wasn't enough. And now, she was going to lose him. A soft knock at the door made her tense. She didn't turn around. She didn't want to see Benjamin's face. She didn't want to hear him say it out loud. But he stepped inside anyway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, you haven't eaten all day, Benjamin said. His voice was quiet, careful. She just stared at the crib. I'm not hungry. A sigh. The sound of him stepping closer. Karen wants to talk to you. I don't want to talk to her. She's not here to take him away from you. Olivia laughed bitterly. Yes, she is. Benjamin was quiet for a long time. Then, she wants to take care of you too. Olivia's breath caught. Slowly, she turned to face him. What? Benjamin's expression was unreadable. She doesn't just want Ryan. Olivia, she wants you too. Her stomach twisted. That doesn't make sense, she said, shaking her head. I'm not her family. She thinks otherwise. She didn't know what to say. Karen wanted her? But why? She wasn't her blood. She wasn't Ryan's real sister. She was just the girl who had found him. And that wasn't enough to make her worthy of staying. An hour later, Olivia found herself sitting across from Karen in the grand sitting room. The woman smiled softly, though there was sadness in her eyes. I know this isn't easy, she said gently. Olivia's hands curled into fists in her lap. Then why are you doing it? Karen sighed. Because he's my grandson. He's my brother. Olivia snapped. Karen didn't even flinch. I know. Olivia's throat tightened. Karen leaned forward, resting her hands on the table between them. Olivia, I see how much you love him. And I know you've taken care of him better than anyone else could have. Olivia's chest ached. So why are you taking him from me? She whispered. Karen's face softened. I'm not. Olivia blinked. Karen reached for her hand, squeezing gently. I don't want to take him from you. Olivia, I want to give you both a home. A home. Olivia shook her head. No, you don't want me. Yes, I do. Karen's voice was steady, firm, and for the first time in Olivia's life, someone was fighting for her. I see you, Olivia, Karen said. I see the way you hold him, the way you protect him, the way you love him, and I know what it means. Olivia's hands shook. You're his sister, in every way that matters. Her breath hitched. You don't have to lose him. Tears burned in Olivia's eyes. But she wasn't ready to believe it. She had spent so long running, surviving, pushing people away before they could hurt her. How was she supposed to let herself belong? I don't know how to be in a family, she whispered. Karen squeezed her hand. We'll figure it out. That night, Olivia sat beside Ryan's crib, watching him sleep. She thought about the past, about the cold, the hunger, the loneliness, and then she thought about the future. A home, a family, something more. And for the first time, she let herself wonder. Maybe this didn't have to be the end. Maybe this was a new beginning. She reached down, brushing a gentle hand over Ryan's cheek. Then, quietly, she whispered, I'll stay. The house felt different now. Not because the walls had changed. Not because the air smelled any different. Not because the warmth of the mansion had suddenly shifted. But because for the first time, Olivia wasn't waiting for it all to be taken away. She had made her choice. She was staying. And yet, the fear still sat inside her, deep, silent, waiting. Could she really trust this? Could she trust them? Could she trust herself to be part of something bigger than just survival? Because surviving was all she had ever known. Now, she had to learn how to live. The sun rose through the tall windows, casting golden light across the wooden floors of Olivia's new bedroom. She hadn't had a real bedroom since she was little. She had always slept in alleyways, in abandoned buildings, under bridges, wherever she could hide. Now, she lay on a real mattress, beneath thick, soft blankets that smelled like lavender instead of damp concrete. For a long time, she just stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it. Was this really her life now? Or was she dreaming? A small whimper pulled her out of her thoughts. Ryan. Her heart clenched as she rolled out of bed and padded across the hallway to his nursery. She hadn't even realized she had memorized the sound of his breathing until now. She peeked into the crib. And there he was, his tiny chest rising and falling. His hand curled into a loose fist. His lips pursed in sleep. Safe, warm, loved. Her fingers itched to reach for him, to pick him up and hold him close like she always had. But she hesitated. Karen had said she was welcome here, that this was her home, too. But what if things were different now? What if she wasn't needed anymore? She wasn't sure how to exist in a world where she wasn't constantly fighting to be seen. She wasn't sure she knew who she was without the struggle. But before she could drown in those thoughts, a voice cut through the quiet. You can pick him up. You know. Olivia jumped, spinning around. Karen stood in the doorway, wrapped in a soft robe, her silver hair loose around her shoulders. She wasn't angry. She wasn't sending Olivia away. She just smiled. He's yours too, she said gently. Go ahead. Olivia's chest ached as she reached into the crib, carefully lifting Ryan into her arms. The moment he settled against her, a tiny sigh escaping his lips. She felt it, the weight of love, of responsibility, of belonging. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe it wasn't temporary. The days passed in a slow, unfamiliar rhythm. Karen was patient. She never pushed, never forced Olivia to be something she wasn't. She just let her exist. Let her be. And Olivia didn't know what to do with that. She wasn't used to being seen without having to fight for it. She wasn't used to being cared for without having to prove she deserved it. But every morning, there was a plate of breakfast waiting for her. Every night, there was a soft voice reminding her, "Good night, sweetheart." Every time she picked up Ryan, no one told her she wasn't allowed. She had spent so much of her life waiting for the other shoe to drop. Waiting for people to change their minds. Waiting for the cold to creep back in. But here, in this house full of warmth and quiet love, nothing changed. She was still here. And every day, that truth settled a little deeper inside her. She wasn't alone anymore. It had been a few weeks since she made her decision to stay when the doorbell rang one evening. She was in the kitchen, bouncing Ryan lightly in her arms, when Karen and the butler exchanged a knowing glance. Then, the door opened, and there he was, Benjamin. For a second, Olivia forgot how to breathe. He looked different somehow. Not in the way he dressed, he was still in his usual crisp suit. His ties slightly loosened like he had rushed here, but in his eyes, they were softer now, lighter, like something had shifted inside him, too. She wasn't sure what to say. So he spoke first. "You look good, kid." She swallowed. "So do you." He chuckled, stepping inside, his hands tucked into his pockets. "I brought something." He set a small bag on the counter. And Olivia's brow furrowed. Ryan squirmed in her arms, reaching toward Benjamin with tiny, eager fingers. Benjamin lifted him effortlessly, his usual stiffness melting away as he pressed a gentle kiss to the baby's forehead. Then, he reached into the bag and pulled out a stuffed bear. Ryan squealed with delight, grabbing at it immediately. Olivia's chest tightened. Benjamin hadn't forgotten. Not about Ryan. Not about her. And that realization shook something loose inside her. Karen cleared her throat lightly, smiling at them. "Benjamin, would you like to stay for dinner?" Olivia's head snapped toward him. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, "Yeah," he said, "I'd like that." That night, they all sat around the dinner table, Karen, Benjamin, Olivia, and Ryan. The conversation was easy, full of soft laughter and gentle teasing. Karen told stories about her childhood. Benjamin actually smiled. Ryan babbled happily, stuffing his chubby fists into his mashed potatoes. And Olivia just watched. She watched as Karen patted Benjamin's hand absent-mindedly, as if they had been family forever. She watched as Benjamin cut his food carefully, pausing every so often to look at her and Ryan, like he still couldn't believe they were here. And slowly, it hit her. She had spent her whole life searching for something like this. And now, it was hers. She had fought for it. She had chosen it. And in return, they had chosen her. Later that night, after dinner was over and Ryan was tucked into his crib, Olivia wandered into the living room. She found Benjamin standing near the window, staring out at the night sky. For a second, she thought about walking away. But then, "I meant what I said," he murmured, still looking at the stars. She hesitated. "About what?" He turned to face her. "That your family." Her throat tightened. And then, to her complete horror, tears burned at the back of her eyes. She quickly wiped at them, cursing herself. But Benjamin just smiled, and pulled her into a hug. She froze. Then, slowly, she let herself sink into it. And for the first time in her life, she let herself believe she was home. The days turned into weeks. The weeks turned into months. And slowly, Olivia stopped expecting it to end. She started waking up and believing she had a future. A home. A family. Something worth fighting for. Because family wasn't about blood. It was about who stayed. And she finally understood. Benjamin, Karen, Ryan, they weren't leaving. She wasn't alone anymore. She never would be again. The storm had passed, but the wreckage remained. Olivia had spent her whole life running from hunger, from loneliness, from the ache of wanting something she could never have. But now, for the first time, she had stopped. And that was when she realized the real battle had just begun. Because some fights don't happen in the streets. Some fights happen inside a home you're afraid of losing. Some fights happen when you finally find something worth staying for. And now, Olivia wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for a family. Kimberly wasn't done. Olivia should have known. She had thought, naively, stupidly, that after Benjamin had told her to stay away, after she had tried and failed to tear them apart, she would finally let go. But people like Kimberly don't let go. They don't lose. And she was about to prove it. It started with the calls. Late at night, the phone would ring, and Karen would answer, her voice tense. She never said who it was. But Olivia knew. She could see it in the way Karen's hands trembled after she hung up. She could hear it in the way Benjamin's voice hardened every time he said her name. Kimberly wasn't just angry. She was desperate. And desperate people are dangerous. The papers arrived a week later. A petition for custody. Kimberly was taking them to court. Olivia's stomach dropped when she overheard Benjamin talking to the lawyer. "This is ridiculous," Benjamin growled. "She doesn't have a case. She doesn't need a case." The lawyer replied, "She has money and connections. If she convinces the judge that Olivia and Ryan are better off with her, it won't matter what the truth is." Olivia's heart pounded. Better off with her? With Kimberly? She pictured it. Ryan being ripped from Karen's arms, handed over to a woman who had never even looked at him with love. And Olivia? She wouldn't have to imagine. She knew what would happen to her. She would be sent back into the system. Back to the streets. Back to nothing. The thought made her want to scream. Benjamin was furious. "She wants control," he muttered. "That's all this is. She doesn't care about them." But caring didn't matter in court. The only thing that mattered was who had the power. And Kimberly had a lot of it. That night, Olivia sat outside, knees pulled to her chest, staring at the sky. She had made a mistake. She had let herself believe she could have this, a home, a family, a life that wasn't built on running. But Kimberly was right about one thing. She wasn't one of them. Karen was rich. Benjamin was rich. Even Ryan, who had come from nothing, had real blood ties to people who could fight for him. But Olivia? She was just a kid who had stumbled into their world. And any minute now, it would spit her back out. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the fear, the anger, the hopelessness curling inside her. Then, a voice. "You know, staring at the stars isn't going to fix anything." Olivia jumped. Benjamin stood near the porch, hands in his pockets, watching her. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. And that scared her more than anything. Because if he was tired, if he was done fighting, then it was over. And she couldn't handle that. So she did what she had always done. She tried to push him away before he could let her go. "You should just let me go," she muttered, looking back at the sky. "It'd be easier." Silence. Then, "I'm not letting you go." "Olivia." Her throat tightened. "You don't have a choice." "Yes, I do." His voice was steady, unshakable. "I have every choice in the world," he said, stepping closer. "And I'm choosing to fight for you." Olivia's breath hitched. She shook her head, voice cracking. "Why?" Benjamin crouched in front of her, meeting her eyes. "Because you're mine." The words shattered her. Because no one had ever said that to her before. No one had ever claimed her. No one had ever made her feel like she belonged. And now, here he was, telling her she wasn't a burden, telling her she wasn't a mistake, telling her she was his family. She felt the first tear fall before she could stop it. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. Benjamin's expression softened. "Neither do I," he admitted. "But we'll figure it out. Together." She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him. So she let him pull her into a hug. And for the first time, she didn't run. The courtroom was cold. Olivia sat beside Karen, her hands curled into tight fists, her heart hammering in her chest. She had never been in a courtroom before. She had never been in a place where people decided things for her. But today, a judge was going to decide where she belonged, where Ryan belonged, and she was terrified. Kimberly sat across the room, her expensive suit flawless, her expression cool and composed. She looked like someone who had already won. The judge spoke. Lawyers argued. Papers were handed back and forth. Olivia barely heard any of it. All she could think about was what would happen if they lost. She would be alone. Ryan would be alone. It would be over. Then, Benjamin stood up. And suddenly, everything changed. "I'm not here to waste your time," Benjamin said. His voice was calm. but there was steel beneath it. I could give you 1,000 reasons why Kimberly Reed is unfit to raise these kids. But the truth is, she doesn't want them. Kimberly bristled. That's ridiculous. Benjamin didn't even look at her. She wants control, he continued. That's all she's ever wanted. He turned to the judge. His voice softer now. But I want them. The words hit Olivia like a punch to the chest. I want them, Benjamin repeated, looking directly at her now. Not because I lost my son. Not because I feel guilty. But because I love them. Olivia's heart stopped. Love. He had never said that before. And now, he was saying it here. In front of everyone. He turned to the judge. I don't care how long this takes. I don't care how much I have to fight. I will not let them be taken away. Silence. The judge studied Benjamin, then Karen, then Olivia. And finally, he spoke. This court finds no legal grounds to remove custody from Mr. Reed and Mrs. Wood. The case is dismissed. It took Olivia a second to understand what had just happened. And then, she felt Benjamin's hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him, tears in her eyes. And he smiled. It was over. They had won. She wasn't going anywhere. And for the first time in her life, Olivia realized she was home. Do you believe Olivia deserves this happy ending? Tell us in the comments below. And if you believe family is about love, not blood, hit the like button to show your support. Because Olivia's story is for everyone who has ever felt like they didn't belong, until someone finally fought for them. The world didn't change overnight. The court had ruled in their favor. Kimberly had lost. Olivia and Ryan weren't going anywhere. But Olivia still woke up half expecting it to be a dream. She still sat up in bed every morning, heart pounding, waiting for someone to tell her it had all been a mistake. Because that was what life had taught her, that everything good was temporary. That safety was a lie. But every morning, Karen was still there. Every morning, Ryan was still in his crib, giggling as she picked him up. And every morning, Benjamin stayed. No one had left. No one had sent her away. She was still here. And slowly, she realized, maybe she always would be. Life at the Wood estate had a rhythm now. Breakfast was no longer something Olivia had to steal or fight for. It was simply waiting for her. Mornings were spent playing with Ryan, feeding him, rocking him when he got fussy, not out of duty. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Afternoons were filled with lessons. Karen had insisted on homeschooling her until they could figure out what to do about school. Olivia had never thought much about education before. Survival had been her only priority. But now, for the first time, she sat at a desk, an actual desk, learning things she had never had the chance to know. She didn't say it out loud, but she liked it. She liked knowing things. She liked the way Karen smiled every time she figured out something new. She liked the way Benjamin hovered nearby, pretending he wasn't listening, but clearly invested. She liked that they cared. She liked being cared for. And that realization scared her more than anything. Because what if she messed this up? What if she wasn't good enough for this life? What if one day, they decided she wasn't worth keeping? It was a simple question. An innocent one. But it wrecked her. Karen had been helping her with a math problem when she casually asked, "Would you like to start at a real school next semester?" Olivia's chest tightened. She stared down at the notebook in front of her, the numbers blurring together. She should have been excited. She should have jumped at the opportunity. But all she felt was fear. Because school meant being around other kids. Kids who had homes. Kids who had families that weren't built out of tragedy and courtrooms and desperate second chances. Kids who had never had to survive the way she had. She wouldn't fit in. She never had. And what if going to school, trying to be normal, made them realize she wasn't? What if Benjamin and Karen saw how different she was? What if they regretted keeping her? What if she lost everything? She didn't realize she was shaking until Karen gently placed a hand over hers. "Olivia," she said softly, "you don't have to decide right now." Olivia nodded quickly, too quickly, and pushed back from the desk. I need air." And then she ran. She didn't go far. She just ran to the garden. Heart pounding, breath coming in sharp gasps. She shouldn't have reacted like that. It was just a question. Karen wasn't sending her away. Benjamin wasn't sending her away. But deep down, she knew the truth. It wasn't about school. It was about belonging. And how she still wasn't sure if she did. She wrapped her arms around herself, fighting against the cold that had nothing to do with the weather. Then, a voice. "You keep running, kid, and you're gonna wear out your shoes." Olivia tensed. She turned, and there was Benjamin, hands in his pockets, watching her with that same unreadable expression. She braced herself for a lecture. For frustration. For him to tell her she was being ridiculous. Instead, he just sighed and sat down on the garden bench. "Want to tell me what's going on?" She hesitated. Then, quietly, "I don't belong here." Benjamin frowned. "Says who?" She swallowed hard. "Says, life." A pause. Then, "That's crap." Olivia blinked. Benjamin leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I get it. You think this is all some mistake. You think one day, we're going to wake up and realize we don't want you anymore." Her throat tightened. Because that was exactly what she thought. Benjamin exhaled. "Look, I can't make you believe me. But I can tell you this, you're not going anywhere." She looked away. "Ryan needs you." Benjamin continued. "Karen needs you." Then, softer. "I need you." Her breath hitched. She looked up at him, eyes wide, searching his face for any sign that he was lying. But he wasn't. He was telling the truth. And for some reason, that truth terrified her. Because needing someone meant they had the power to hurt you. And she wasn't sure she could survive another loss. So she did what she always did. She deflected. "You don't need me," she muttered. "You just feel guilty about Lucas." She regretted the words instantly. Benjamin stiffened. His jaw clenched. She waited for him to get mad. But he didn't. Instead, he just let out a slow breath and said, "Maybe at first, but not anymore." She stared at him. And for the first time, she let herself believe it. She didn't run again after that. She still had doubts. She still had fears. But every time they crept in, she remembered what Benjamin had said. "You're not going anywhere." And every time she was tempted to pull away, Karen was there, steady, patient, never pushing but never letting go either. Every morning, Ryan still reached for her like she was his whole world. And maybe she was. Maybe she wasn't just a girl who had found a baby in the trash. Maybe she wasn't just a burden, a problem, a mistake. Maybe she was a sister. Maybe she was a daughter. Maybe she belonged. And for the first time, she let herself believe. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a mistake. This was home. Months passed. Seasons change. And Olivia didn't leave. She went to school. She made friends. She still had moments of doubt. Moments of fear. Moments when she woke up expecting it to all be gone. But every time, someone was there. Karen with her soft reassurances. Benjamin with his gruff, steady presence. Ryan with his tiny hands reaching for her. As if he knew she would always be there. She had a life now. A future. A family. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid to fight for it. Because she had already won. No one tells you what happens after you find a home. No one tells you that even after the fight is over, the battle inside you doesn't just disappear. Olivia had been in the Wood estate for months now. But there were still mornings when she woke up in a panic. Heart racing, expecting to find herself back in the cold. Alone, Ryan gone. She had been given a second chance. A family that had chosen her. A home that was hers to keep. So why did it still feel like she didn't deserve it? Why did the past still hold her by the throat? And why did she still feel like a ghost, lingering on the edges of a life that wasn't really hers? It started with a simple letter. Karen had found it in the mail. Her expression unreadable as she handed it to Olivia over breakfast. "It's from the state," she said gently. Olivia hesitated before unfolding the paper. Her hands already shaking. Then she saw the words at the top of the page. Bold and cold and suffocating. "Biological records request." Her stomach twisted. "They found my file," she whispered. Karen nodded, watching her carefully. "You don't have to read it." But Olivia already had. The letter explained that someone, her biological family, had filed a request to see if she was still alive. She stared at the words, her heartbeat roaring in her ears. She had spent years believing she had no one. Believing she had been left behind. Believing no one had ever looked for her. And now, suddenly, she was supposed to believe someone had? Olivia didn't tell Benjamin right away. She didn't know how. She didn't even know how to process it herself. So she sat with it. She held onto the letter like a secret, tucked away in the drawer beside her bed. But it felt like it was burning a hole through her reality. Did she want to know? Did she want to see the names? The history? The truth of where she had come from? Or was it safer to leave it buried? Was it safer to stay in the life she had now and never look back? She thought about Ryan, about Karen, about the way Benjamin had fought for her when no one else had. She already had a family. She didn't need the past. Right? But then, late one night, she found herself sitting in the living room, staring at the fire, lost in thought. And that's when Benjamin sat down beside her. He didn't say anything at first. Just sat there, silent, waiting. Then, I know. Her breath caught. She turned to him, and he met her gaze with that same steady, unshakable presence that had become her anchor. I know about the letter, he said quietly. She looked away. She shouldn't have been surprised. Nothing got past him. You didn't tell me, he added. There was no anger in his voice. Just something else, something softer. She swallowed hard. I didn't know how. Silence stretched between them. Then, do you want to meet them? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. I don't know, she admitted. And that was the truth. She didn't know what she wanted. Because the thought of meeting the people who had left her behind was enough to make her sick. But the thought of never knowing the truth was just as terrifying. Benjamin nodded, as if he understood. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. Olivia frowned. What's that? He handed it to her. She unfolded it carefully and froze. A name. Her mother's name. Her vision blurred. How did you? I have resources, he said simply. She stared at him, and suddenly, it hit her. He had already started looking for her, before she even decided if she wanted to. Because he knew she would need answers, even if she was too afraid to admit it. And for some reason, that realization made her want to cry. She gripped the paper so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then she whispered, "Will you come with me?" Benjamin didn't hesitate. Always. The meeting was set for the following week. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some big, life-changing reunion. It was a quiet afternoon in a small office. Just Olivia, Benjamin, and a woman she had never seen before. Her mother. She was nothing like Olivia imagined. Not cruel, not cold, just tired, worn down by life, by mistakes, by a grief that sat heavy in her eyes. I didn't know if you'd come, her mother said, her voice hoarse. Olivia stared at her, heart pounding, fingers curled into fists. I almost didn't, she admitted. Her mother nodded, her throat bobbing. I deserve that. Silence. Then, I need to know, Olivia whispered. Why? Her mother let out a slow, shaky breath. I was young, she said, and stupid, and I thought you'd be better off without me. Olivia flinched. The words felt like knives. Because all she had ever wanted, all she had ever needed, was to be wanted. And now, sitting in front of the woman who had left her behind, she wasn't sure what to feel. Anger? Sadness? Relief? I'm sorry, her mother whispered. I know that's not enough. I know it won't change anything. But I need you to know, I never stopped thinking about you. Olivia swallowed hard. She had spent so many years believing she was nothing. That no one had cared. That she had been abandoned because she wasn't worth keeping. And now, here was this woman, her mother, telling her she had been wanted all along. Tears burned in her eyes. She wiped them away before they could fall. I don't know what you expect from me, she said quietly. Her mother shook her head. Nothing. I just needed to see you. More silence. Then, softly, I have a family now, Olivia said, and I don't need another one. Her mother's breath hitched, but she nodded. I understand. Olivia stood up. So did Benjamin. She turned to her mother one last time. I'm not angry, she said honestly. I don't know what I feel. But, I think I'm okay now. And for the first time, she really meant it. She wasn't broken. She wasn't lost. She had a family. And that was enough. She walked out of the office without looking back. That night, Olivia sat on the porch, staring at the sky. Benjamin sat beside her, hands in his pockets. You okay? He asked. She let out a slow breath. Yeah, she said. I think I am. She turned to him, hesitating before saying the words that had been aching to come out for weeks. Thank you, she whispered. He glanced at her. For what? For everything. For fighting for her. For finding her before she even knew she needed to be found. For being the father she had never had. Benjamin exhaled, then reached out and ruffled her hair. It was something small, something stupid, but it felt like home. And Olivia? She finally believed it was. For good. The seasons change. Snow melted into soft, green grass. Flowers bloomed along the garden paths. Ryan took his first steps on the sun-warmed patio, his tiny hands reaching out, trusting that someone would always be there to catch him. And Olivia? For the first time in her life, she wasn't running anymore. She had spent years searching for a place to belong, believing she was unwanted, believing that love was something meant for other people, but never for her. And yet, here she was, in a home that was hers, with a family that had chosen her, with a life that she had once thought was impossible. She had won, not in the way she used to think about winning, not by fighting, not by surviving, not by clawing her way through the world just to make it another day. She had won because she had finally let herself be loved, and that was the greatest victory of all. She never used to know what day her birthday was. Dates didn't matter when every day was about finding the next meal, the next place to sleep, the next fight to survive. But one morning, Karen placed a small, wrapped box in front of her at breakfast and said, "Happy birthday, sweetheart." Olivia had just stared at it. Benjamin had cleared his throat. "Technically, it's a little early, but we figured it was time to make it official." She blinked. "Make what official?" Karen smiled softly. "Your adoption." The world stopped. Olivia couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She could barely hear anything over the pounding of her heart. Because for all this time, for all the ways she had started to believe she belonged, there was still that tiny, broken part of her that had always wondered, what if they changed their minds? What if she was just temporary? But now, that fear was gone. Because this wasn't temporary. This was forever. She reached for the box with shaking hands, her throat tight with emotions too big to name. Inside was a small, silver necklace with the letter W engraved on it. Wood. Her name. Her real name. A name that wasn't tied to pain or loss or things left behind. A name that meant family. She swallowed back the tears burning her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Karen reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "We love you, Olivia," she said softly, "and we always will." She had spent her whole life waiting to hear those words. And now, she finally believed them. Later that night, Olivia found Benjamin sitting on the back porch, watching the sunset. She hesitated, then stepped outside and sat beside him. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then, quietly, she said, "Do you ever think about Lucas?" Benjamin exhaled, running a hand down his face. "All the time," he admitted. She nodded, looking down at her hands. "Do you think he would have liked me?" Benjamin turned to her, eyebrows furrowed. Then, to her complete horror, he laughed. Not a sharp laugh, not a sad laugh, a real one. "He would have loved you," he said, "probably would have been annoying about it, too." She smiled. Then, after a long pause, "Do you ever regret keeping me?" Benjamin's face softened. "Never." Her throat tightened. And before she could talk herself out of it, she leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. She felt him tense, just for a second. Then he let out a breath and wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. They didn't say anything after that. They didn't have to. Because Olivia finally knew the truth. She wasn't a replacement for the son he had lost. She wasn't a burden. She wasn't a mistake. She was his daughter, in every way that mattered. And he was never letting her go. For the first time, Olivia could imagine a future. She could imagine graduating from school, not just existing, but thriving. She could imagine Ryan growing up with her, calling her his sister, never knowing the kind of loneliness she had lived through. She could imagine Karen helping her pick out a dress for prom. She could imagine Benjamin walking her down the aisle someday. She could imagine happiness. She could imagine forever. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. Olivia's story isn't just hers. It's for anyone who has ever felt lost. For anyone who has ever felt like they don't belong. For anyone who has ever been told they aren't enough. But here's the truth. You are enough. You are worthy of love. You are worthy of belonging. And no matter where you come from, no matter what battles you've had to fight, you deserve to be chosen. Because family isn't just about blood. It's about who stays. And just like Olivia, you can find your way home. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Do you think Olivia finally found her forever family? And if you believe family isn't just about blood, but about love, hit the like button to show your support. Comment below. What was your favorite moment in Olivia's journey? Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that will move you, inspire you, and remind you of the things that truly matter. Because every story has the power to change a life. And sometimes, a story like Olivia's is exactly what someone needs to hear.